Welcome to the Content Repurposer podcast, where we can find ways how authors can repurpose their book's content into different mediums. So for today's guest, we have John Launius, and he is the CEO of Shihan Wellness and Shihan Consultants. He serves as an executive talent development coach, organizational culture consultant, and peak performance facilitator. Additionally, John is a certified Kōmoto in the 1400-year-old Japanese tradition of incense appreciation, Koh-do. He offers the incense journey for groups, the personal incense journey, and therapeutic fragrance hypnosis for individuals, which you can learn more about it on shihanwellness.com and shihan-consultants.com. But without further ado, let's get back into the podcast. Thank you so much, John, for joining the podcast. And I just wanted to first start on, because we've met a couple of times in the past, and I've known you since you've been on Vidsu Media. And I was just curious, what made you want to start your own company, and what path did you go to want to even start that path?
So great question. So my first businesses actually started back in the 90s. I had one of the largest retail stores in the country that did a lot of importing and exporting of fragrances. And I had a defensive tactics company that taught military, government, law enforcement. And this was all before 9/11. So when 9/11 happened, I got recruited and I worked for a number of different intelligence agencies. I'm known as an OGA contractor during that time. And if 9/11 wouldn't have happened, I probably would have continued on being a serial entrepreneur. But sometimes your skill sets land you in really interesting places. And so I did that up until 2006 when I came back to St. Louis and worked for WashU for almost 6 years. And so it just kept, like, opportunities kept arriving. And so if I look at the development of Shihan Consultants and Shihan Wellness, which are my two companies now, I look at the fact that my background spans government, education, technology, media, marketing, and branding, and I'm not 20 anymore. And so sometimes when the world kind of looks at you, you're like, oh, well, you've been doing this a long time. Your skill set and your ability to contribute is pretty wide, which can mean you're more expensive than, say, a 20-year-old, right? And so this idea was that I wanted to be able to continue to make the differences that I make really in two areas, which is traditional business, but also the internal journey. And so if I look at the juxtaposition between Shihan Consultants and Shihan Wellness, is that Shihan Consultants really is that external journey. It's learning more. It's learning about communication. It's learning how to grow your business in a whole number of areas. And we do that, number one, with our flagship offering called Forward. And instead of a retreat, the Forward is a business accelerator program that allows any company from any industry to be able to look at what's working and what's not working. And then it creates a really powerful experience. Then if I look at Shihan Wellness houses the self-defense and defensive tactics that I do. It also houses the fragrance work that I do, and then also the hypnosis work that I do. So if you're looking at the fact that all business is an external and an internal journey, then Shihan Consultants and Shihan Wellness really represent two sides of that same coin.
That's interesting, because I know that there's a lot of accelerator programs, but I've never heard an option of wellness as well. So how did you come up with pairing the two?
Yeah. Well, so it really just kind of came up over years and years and years of working with different companies where, I might work with an executive who says, yes, we need some workforce performance and training. And that's a lot of my background, is that I'm a certified professional trainer and developer of a number of different things. But then, the executive might say, listen, I really want to get my head game in the right place. And so, well, there's ways to do that. There's visualization, there's hypnosis, there's a whole number of ways to really put yourself in the right place. And that, when you really think about it, everything is a head game, everything. And so everything is mental. And so when you're looking at creating your company, growing your company, inspiring others, etc., you're really using the ability to get your mind in the right place inside of every environment that you're in. That was really the integration of both Shihan Consultants and Shihan Wellness, in that, again, Shihan Consultants is that external journey and Shihan Wellness is that internal journey. Putting that two together really makes a very powerful experience for yourself and then everyone around you.
I was also just wondering, because how did you get into fragrance? Because I know a lot of people, they talk about wellness, but it's more of a mental well-being. But how did you link fragrance
Mhm.
within Shihan wellness?
Yeah. So when I was 9 years old, I started studying two things: martial arts and world fragrance traditions. And usually the next question, kind of like you right there, is, well, how did that happen? Well, my mother sent me to martial arts class, and Mr. Black, my first martial arts teacher, was burning what I would call now bad incense. America gets privy to a lot of bad incense, a lot of synthetics, bad colors. I mean, I could go on for about 20 minutes, but he was burning now what I call bad incense, but that was the entree for me. But I was fascinated. What is this thing that you light up that's got fragrance and smoke? And then as I'm watching the smoke, I find myself almost like mesmerized. And so it fascinated me. So I took some home, didn't tell my mom, and I was lighting it in my room. And then all of a sudden from across the house, you could hear her running, kicks the door. And what are you doing? I said, I'm burning incense. She said, you can't do that. I'm like, what do you mean I can't do that? You sent me to martial arts class, Mr. Black. She said, no. She's like, you can do this, but you just got to let me know because you could burn down the house. I'm like, oh, okay. And then she said, if this is interesting to you, and obviously I'm taking a couple of conversations and putting them into one story, but she said, if this is interesting to you, here's a book on world religions. And I said, why are you giving me a book on world religion? She said, John, because every culture and every religion has had incense at some point in their history. And so the written history of incense is 6,000 years old. The archaeological evidence of incense is 35,000 years old. That comes from the caves in southern France called Chauvet, and specifically Bear Skull Cave, where inside of Bear Skull Cave, there's a raised rock, and inside of this cave, there's lots of bear skulls, hence the name. And one of those bear skulls is turned upside down and put on a raised rock, and then somebody 35,000 years ago went and grabbed some pine needles, put them in there, and lit them up, and didn't touch them for 35,000 years. But we know that incense, or the idea of incense, and the word incense comes from the Latin incensum, meaning to burn through. But somebody right after the advent of fire put something fragrant on the fire to stoke it, keep it going, and said, oh, well, my sinuses are opening up. I feel really good. Then you started to get into this idea that who are the wisdom keepers? Who are these people that understand the natural world? Because up until about 120 years ago, we got all of our healing from our water, from our food, and from fragrances. Now, we've always had medicine, but the idea that 120 years ago or so, someone said, oh, well, people are lazy, let's make a pill, and then let's make another pill, let's make another pill, and then 120 years later, we're watching television at night, and there's a commercial about some pharmaceutical where everyone's really happy, but then you go on for 90 seconds about side effects. Oh, including death. And so going back to your original question about why is fragrance so important when you talk about wellness? Well, our sense of smell is connected to our limbic system. And our limbic system is a very powerful system within our brain that controls emotions and feelings and memories and all of that. And so when you smell something that's enjoyable, Pooja, what happens to your being? What happens to your emotional state?
I think of it's probably nostalgia. There's like certain perfumes that I have. I remember there was a Bath and Body Works perfume
Mm-hmm.
that my mom used to wear when I
Mm-hmm.
was younger, and it just reminds me of Christmas because it would always be there every single time we would light the tree or every time that season happened. It was just that scent just reminds me
Mm-hmm.
of that time.
And so is that time for you a very positive and happy time?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're able to change the quality of your experience of reality very quickly because our sense of smell is also the only sense that does not go through the thalamus. And the thalamus is one aspect of our limbic system. But our sense of smell goes directly to the oldest part of our brain called the rhinocephalon, which again controls emotions and feelings, etc. And so by you accessing that very positive feeling of remembering Christmas, you're able to change the quality of your being in a moment. Well, how does this play out in business, and how does this play out for a whole number of different people? Well, I work with individuals with PTSD, whether they are a veteran, a first responder, or even an executive. Because if you're a business owner and you're listening to this, you know that, running a business can be just as traumatic as being a breacher with some kind of special military team. And so what we start to look at is what is the internal journey and what is the external journey. And fragrance is a very powerful way to bring back the kinds of memories that you want, or even bring back the kinds of memories that you don't want, that you want to separate emotional connection to. Part of the reason why that people experience any level of PTSD, and if we're really being honest, all of us have had different types of trauma during the course of our lives. And so by being able to re-experience these things with a separation, this is where, for me, coaching comes into play and hypnosis comes into play, and different modalities that allow us to safely re-experience the things from our past that are truly in the past. They're not even real, but we act like that they're real. And so by then having an experience of going through these emotional journeys and disconnecting the emotional connection to that, then we say, and we have the experience of being more radiant, because we start to quite literally lighten up. We're a lot lighter. We're not carrying all that weight of, 20 years of trauma or 20 years of anger or frustration, etc. And so it quite literally is, you're creating more brilliance and radiance for yourself. And so it is a holistic way to look at this. And if you're curious, St. Louis Business Journal just did a quick little piece on me about wellness and about fragrance. But here's the other thing. There's negative connotation around the word incense because of the 1960s, because people were burning now what I call bad incense. But the majority of what I do, unless requested otherwise, is smokeless incense. Quite literally, it's just pure fragrance. And there have been people who said, oh, I don't like fragrance. It bothers me. I'm like, well, give this a try. And by giving it a try, people are like, oh my gosh, I've never experienced anything like this before. And so I've done this for luminaries, people that you would well know in business and in entertainment, but I've also done it for just the regular old person like ourselves that just kind of do what we do and go through life. And so I look at just the last week when I presented to the Kauffman Fund and also Special Operations Charity Network, which are two veterans organizations, and we post about that on my LinkedIn. But the point that I'm making, and I appreciate the question, is that all of this is holographic. We act like on one level that our work life and our home life are separate, and they're not, because everything that happens to us at work affects us at our home, and everything that happens at home affects us at work. And so how do you create that integration? Well, there's things that I've been doing for over 25 years for very Fortune 500 companies, all the way down to just different types of communities. And so it's always customized, but it really is pretty amazing how you can create profound difference for people by focusing on the humanness of the things we do, not just so much on religion or any other thing that could separate us as opposed to connect us.
I just remember when you said fragrance and you were explaining different things, it just reminded me there's like different senses that we have. We have sight, we have hearing, we have sense of smell. And for me, I think there's like certain times when people just ask, oh, like if you had the option, what sense of smell, sight, what would you lose? What are the things that you would lose? And I know it sounds bad, but I was like, oh, sense of smell. But now I realized that you would lose a part of nostalgia. You would lose a part of history if you couldn't smell things. Because I think when you eat food, you smell. There's a sense of smell to eat. And then sense of taste. If you lose a sense of smell, how much nostalgia or how much something you would lose based on that.
Yeah, well, our taste is primarily fragrance. So the majority of our ability to taste comes from our ability to smell. And so here's the other interesting thing to realize is that here, I'll just do an exercise with you that I will often do with groups. When you walk into someone's house that you've never been into before, how long do you quote unquote smell their house?
Probably for like a few seconds.
Yeah, anywhere between 35 seconds to maybe a minute and a half, depending on how long it takes the receptors to fill up inside your olfactory bulb and system for that matter. And so we're doing this all throughout life. We're walking into environments. We have a sense of the smell at first, and if you're not focused on it, it very quickly disappears. But I'm going to be kind of dramatic now. So if you're in someone's house that you've never been in before, and then all of a sudden you see someone get murdered or something very traumatic, well, that smell of their house is locked inside your brain now, and you don't even realize it anymore. And so then when you go out through life and you're recovering and you're coming back from this really, awful experience that you had, and then you walk into another space that reminds you of that, you're going to go right back to that. And so another example is that when my father passed away, one of the last things that I did was that I cleaned his closet. And as I got into his closet, there was a shirt that was covered in plastic. And when I opened it up, there were scent molecules still on there related to him. And then he was there with me again. And so this is North America primarily has a very small connection to the power of fragrance and what it can do for you from a psychological, from a spiritual standpoint. And again, in business, I'm not talking so much about spirituality, but I am talking about who are you being? Because who we're being is always going to be a lot louder than what we're doing. And so by using fragrance as a way to go back or to go forward in time, to have different types of experiences, it connects us to who we are in the moment. In other words, if I'm worried about the past and I'm talking to you in the present like I am right now, well, I'm not really that present. And so you and I can experience a fragrance that connects us. I mean, one of the best fragrances to really have an emotional connection to somebody else is sandalwood. I'm talking about Santalum album, the sandalwood that comes from India. There's a couple different out there in the market that one's from Australia, one's from Hawaii, but real true sandalwood only comes from India. And from the Ayurvedic tradition, it's known as the great receiver. And so by experiencing this fragrance, and I'm talking the terpenes and all the chemicals that come along with that, is that you literally start to relax. And so when you're in the presence of somebody, normally when we're in the presence of our friends, if they're our true friends, well, they create a space of relaxation for us, and then it creates a space of really connecting. So imagine, taking an experience where you want to connect with other business leaders or you want to connect with new clients. And we've all, if you're in business and you've done networking, is that you've all gone to some kind of an event where usually alcohol is involved in that. And that's not a bad thing. Alcohol might relax you a little bit. But if you want to make a real honest and true connection with somebody and someone's 4 or 5 drinks in, well, first of all, it's unprofessional, but also it's very difficult to connect with them. And so what I've done for the past 30 years with businesses is that I take their executives and we literally go through something called the incense journey. It can be very traditional because I have trained traditionally in the Japanese incense ceremony. I'll talk about that here in a minute. But, imagine taking 2 hours with these executives and you're giving them an experience of these fragrances that create mental clarity, that relax them, that expand the quality of their consciousness, meaning that, most of the things that I do are psychotropics. They're not psychedelics, they're psychotropics, and psychotropics change the quality of our consciousness. So alcohol is considered a psychotropic. And obviously if you drink too much alcohol, well, that, can go bad for you. But all these things change the quality of our consciousness. And so the fragrances that I use are changing the quality of consciousness that connect us in a very powerful, deep and human way, separate from anything else that can separate us. And when you think about it, there's a lot more things in the world that can separate us than can connect us. And so by looking at the humanness of what's possible, by looking at the fact that we all want more growth in life, these are the kind of the entree conversations that get us into creating the kinds of programs that I create that have been very effective for companies all over. I did promise you that I'll give you the last piece of my training. Between the ages of 13 and 23, I trained under a qualified and certified Kōmoto. So what does that mean? So a Kōmoto is a master of the Japanese incense ceremony. The Japanese incense ceremony goes back, 1,400 years. It goes back even further, but from a Japanese standpoint, when they started, really codifying it back in the Muromachi period, it became a way to use fragrance to connect with others. And so from the ages of 13 to 23, I trained officially or traditionally. And so the way you want to think about me is that I'm kind of like a sommelier, but for all natural fragrances. I am the equivalent of a Japanese tea master, but for the Japanese incense ceremony. And so though I don't do a lot of traditional Japanese incense ceremonies anymore because they take about 4 to 5 hours and can kind of depending on the fragrance quality, it can be very expensive. But I have now modified that to create different types of experiences that do not offend in any way, shape, or form. Even if you think that you don't like fragrance, this becomes a very powerful tool to connect with others. And, if you go to my LinkedIn and look at my articles, there's one there called The Scent of Peak Performance, and it talks a little bit about the work that I've done with luminaries in business and things like that.
Wow, it's crazy because for me, honestly, I haven't explored fragrance a lot. So it's just interesting to see how everything like connects based on fragrance.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I went to, I don't know if it was a workshop, but it was a place where you were actually doing the incense and you were showcasing the different types of scents,
Mm-hmm.
as well as you were also showcasing the book that you created. So
Mm-hmm.
I was just curious, what made you want to write a book? And can you explain a little bit more about what it's about?
Sure. Yeah. So the book you're talking about is my 2020 book called The Life and Times of Missouri's Charles Parsons Between Art and War. And so I knew that, like we all have a book inside of us somewhere, right? And when you read the statistic that like 98% of people who start a book never finish it, I'm the kind of guy that when I start something, I'll finish it. It might take me a while, but in this case, the Parsons book took me a decade, but it needed to take a decade, and I'll tell you why. So in 2006, when I left my work with the government, I went to Washington University in St. Louis, and specifically, I went to the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum, part of the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts. And I was hired as their director of security and training and operations. And it was fascinating. Like I would wake up every day next to de Kooning's and Picasso's and all these beautiful pieces of art. And anyway, after about 9 months of being there, and our first job was to get the museum open, and that opened in October of 2006. But after that, we started looking at the collection in general, and the director, who's fantastic, Sabina Ekman, she's still there. She said, we're going to get out the 19th century collection. And I was like, great, that'll be fun. And I really wasn't, I enjoyed the 19th century, but I really didn't know that much about it. But all of a sudden, when we're getting out all of these art and artifacts from the 19th century, I noticed that there's all of these Japanese incense, utensils and art and accoutrements on the table. And I'm like, I get very excited, and I start looking at things, and she's like, what are you doing? And I said, I said, that's wrong. And she goes, what do you mean that's wrong? And I said, well, that's a Tokugawa incense burner, but it says bowl. And she said, who's the Tokugawa? And I said, the Tokugawa ruled Japan for 263 years, from 1603 to essentially 1867. And then you'd go to another thing called a Kogo. And a Kogo is a chipped incense holder. And again, it was labeled as unknown. And then suddenly I'm looking at like 10 or 12 different objects that are labeled incorrectly that have been in this collection. And I'm like, where did this all come from? Well, I would learn that there was a gentleman by the name of Charles Parsons, and Charles Parsons lived from 1824 to 1905. He was originally from Cortland County, New York, and made his way across the West in the 19th century, went to Keokuk, Iowa, had a failed bank there, came back to St. Louis, and then a little thing called the Civil War broke out. Well, during the Civil War, he and his brother, Lewis B. Parsons, began to redesign the way that the U.S. government does, work with contractors during wartime, and totally redesigns the way that work is done, and saved the Union millions and millions of dollars. Well, after the war, Charles Parsons is now friends with General Sherman and General Grant, who would become President Grant, and starts to collect art. Well, in 1870, he starts traveling around the world, and he does this twice, 1870 and then also 1894. But he takes a great interest in fragrance and takes a great interest in incense. And so I'm probably one of the very few people in the world that could have recognized the collection that he had at WashU and be able to put some context to it. And so what started originally as essays in correcting pieces of the collection. Like my first essay was on this incense burner, on this Tokugawa incense burner that was labeled as a bowl. Well, in that essay, I demonstrated all the different iconography and what it meant, and then that would lead to the next piece and the next piece, and then a friend of mine who was at WashU, who then went to Harvard, who then went to Yale, who has become the editor on many of my books, she's like, look, you're giving these lectures on Charles Parsons. You've been doing that now for 5 years. Will you just write the book? Well, had Google had not started digitizing digital collections around 2008, there would have been no way to write this book, because so much about Charles Parsons' life was hidden in these historical archives that I would have either had to travel in person to go and find this information and then be lucky if I found something. But now that they were putting these things online, I could fairly easily, I mean, it still took me, like I said, 10 years to research and write the book. But by the time that I got where I needed to get with, I had a complete, book with photos and just tell this amazing story. And so in chapter 9 of the book, I cover Charles Parsons's incense collection specifically, and put that out. There's also a YouTube channel that I took about a minute from each one of the chapters of the book, and you can find that as Charles Parsons on YouTube, or Charles Parsons book, and then you'll find it. But there's lots of different videos related to that. But what I enjoyed about that was that I was able to take something. Well, actually, there's Charles Parsons right behind me, right there. So there's Charles right there. I was able to, take this man's life and put it into a form that people could, take in pretty easily. Like just a couple other highlights, Charles Parsons moved us from the silver standard to the gold standard. If you're in St. Louis, for example, and if you've ever heard of Art Hill is named Art Hill because of Charles Parsons. He was one of the 7 people that made the building that is the St. Louis Art Museum to be used in perpetuity following the 1904 World's Fair. Also, the mummies that are at the St. Louis Art Museum, he purchased in person in 1894 and said, I want these on display for free in perpetuity. And so that's part of the reason why that the St. Louis Art Museum is free, assuming that there's not a special exhibition.
Wow, it's crazy because it's not something we think about. You think of like street names, or you think of different monuments, and you're not aware of there's someone who named those streets. There's a reason behind all of those things, and
Mm-hmm.
we just don't realize it because it's not on a day-to-day basis of something we're aware of.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also just great to have at least a reminder of where we came from, or who brought mummies, because I probably wouldn't have known that. I think also, especially in St. Louis, a lot of the museums are free, so people go, but I don't think people realize that people have bought and purchased these things
Mm-hmm.
to present for people
Mm-hmm.
for like years to come.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess it's more just like being appreciative of like the people who have come before us
Mm-hmm.
to give us the things that we have.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting, when you're just talking about how the mummies, right? And like, how do you purchase a mummy? Well, what I love about this particular piece of Charles Parsons's life, and my also work with fragrance and incense, is that he bought these mummies from a guy by the name of Emil Brugsch. And Emil Brugsch was brothers with Heinrich Brugsch. And Heinrich Brugsch was the first person to translate Demotic, which is Egyptian cursive. But these two gentlemen, the Brugschs, were in Egypt. And I mean, they were archaeologists. And what I mean by that in the 19th century is that you were basically a grave robber, because you're going to sell these mummies to rich Europeans. But one of the interesting things is that there's an incense, an Egyptian incense called kaifi. And it was used by Plutarch, and it was used by all these different, people and cultures over time. But this incense is 3,500 years old, and it was rediscovered in 1859 because of Heinrich Brugsch. And so there is a connection to the things that I do today with fragrance and Charles Parsons and the Brugschs. And though a lot of horrible things happened in the 19th century, there's a lot of horrible things that are happening now. But to your point, if we don't know our history, then we will forget about our history. And it's not that history repeats itself. It's that people repeat themselves. And so understanding that gives us a much better, understanding of not only the history, but also our business. It's like, what are you doing in your businesses now that are going to create the new kind of success you have in the future? And so, if I go even back further to something you said, like, why would you start these companies again? Well, I could I could go and attempt to find myself in a role in a company. I'd be very good at it. I've been very good at that for many, many years, but I'm fitting inside of somebody else's cubicle, essentially. So now what I'm able to do is I'm able to take my entire life experience and history and success around business and training and different types of modalities that have you be very effective. And I'm able to bring that to the clients that I work with, whether it's through Shihan Consultants or through Shihan Wellness.
Whenever you stated that, I was thinking of like a mirror of how history parallels, or it's like a reflection of us, and how we are I would say we're very similar in the way that we behave.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we don't remember parts of history, then we will forget certain patterns that we do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and we also forget that we're all kind of going through very similar experiences. And I've had this experience pretty powerfully on social media over the past few years. Like when I'm married, and so sometimes I'll look at kind of marriage content online, and the same types of experiences and the same types of things that I experience with my wife, I'm seeing it playing out with other people. And so how this relates to our growth is that we sometimes think we're the only person that's having this particular kind of experience with depression or other types of things that may impact us from time to time, when in actuality, we're all experiencing that. And so to be able, and not to use buzzwords like safe spaces or things like that, but when we're able to connect with ourselves and the people around us and really begin to grow and expand inside the areas, there's absolute truth to talking things out. And that's why therapy is effective. And that's why different types of exposure therapies are very effective. And so even though I'm not a licensed therapist, I work with a lot of licensed therapists, because there are some people, like if you're really dealing with some mental trauma and you're working with a therapist, well, I might be brought in to bring the incense journey to your community of therapists and other individuals, to really just start to relax and to feel these wonderful fragrances that naturally relax you, just in the same way that you have music that relaxes you. There's all different types of music in the world. There's all different types of fragrances in the world. And so how do you dial into that? Well, with music, it's a little easier. Oh, I like this. I like that kind of music. I like, for this and that. Well, fragrance becomes a little more, the dialing in process takes a little bit longer. So if you're working with me in hypnosis, for example, I might do an intake where if you said, I want to do fragrance hypnosis, I'm like, great, perfect. And so then I start to have a conversation with you about what it is that you like and what you don't like. If you grew up in a rural environment and there are lots of woods around you, I have a pretty good idea of the fragrances that I'm going to introduce to you or reintroduce to you that are pretty effective. If you're saying things to me like, John, I hear what you're saying. I see what you're saying. Notice what I did there, hear and see. That also tells me how you're oriented in the sense of like, hearing and seeing and things like that. So how we communicate with each other gives us insights into how we orient ourselves with reality. And so this is a very quick way to describe that. When I'm working with individuals, when I'm working with companies, when I'm working groups, there are certain things that I'm doing to be very effective across anyone that I'm talking to.
It's also really important. So I think also when you said you have like the experience, or I was just curious, when you wrote the book, I know it took you like 10 years to write. So what was the reason for waiting? Because I think like all of us have a book in us. And
Mm-hmm.
so some of us are really impatient and we just want to write the book.
Right.
But what made you want to wait?
Well, it's not that I wanted to wait, is that as I would, so how this process started was I would write the essays and then I started to write the talks. And so based on the available information to me, and then as I discovered more and more after 2008, is that by the time that we get essentially to 2018, 2019, is that I finally had enough information, verified, researched information from a historical standpoint that I felt comfortable. And then my editor at the time, she's at Harvard. She calls me and she uses an expletive, which I'm not going to use, but you can fill it in as you want. She goes, you have enough information, just write the book. And so what I did was I took 9 months, and I shouldn't have done it this way because I injured myself, like not a joke. I reached out to the publisher. I pitched the book. They were like, great. When can it be done? And I'm like, I'll have it done for you by August 14th, 2019. Well, in my contract, it basically, if I didn't deliver the book on that due date, I owed them $10,000. So all of a sudden life changed because I didn't want to owe them $10,000. And so I worked at every evening and every weekend. And I had no idea how hard it is to write a book, especially when you are like, it's easy to write, but then what about the editing process? What about letting somebody else look at it? And if you're somebody who thinks you're perfect, don't go write a book because your editors will show you pretty quick how you are not perfect, but they make you better. And I learned so much about myself and about what I'm capable of doing by writing the book. And actually, the timing of this interview is really perfect because yesterday I finished the last and final pass of my new book called Love and Letters in World War II, about the love letters between my grandparents during World War II, so that I was able to send it out to the readers. And so I had a wonderful note last night from Daniel Taney. And if you don't know who Daniel Taney is a U.S. NASA astronaut, former, but he shows up in my book, actually his family more specifically, that I discovered in the process. And so I sent it to him and I said, Dan, here is, I'm very pleased to present you with the reader copy of the manuscript. And then he emailed me back a couple hours later. He goes, John, this is so perfect. He goes, I'm stuck in an airport for 10 hours and I'm already halfway through your book. I'm like, awesome. And so there's absolute truth again to what my editor would tell me. She said, John, and her name's Teresa Huntsman, by the way, she's a PhD. She's fantastic. But she said, these books will take on a life of their own, and they really do. So if we're jumping back to the Charles Parsons book for a minute, since that time, I mean, I've given numerous talks on Charles Parsons. I've got one coming up in September over in Clayton, Missouri. But I also got to take part in a documentary. And so there was, one of Charles Parsons' contributions to education was Parsons College, which was started in 1875 and then was in existence till around 1969, and then they went bankrupt. Well, then there's this guy by the name of the Maharishi Mahesh who taught the Beatles and decided to buy a school in Iowa, in Fairfield, Iowa specifically. So he buys Parsons College and turns it into the Maharishi Mahesh International University, which is now the world headquarters of Transcendental Meditation. So people like Oprah and Jim Carrey and other people will go to Fairfield, which is, it is the strangest amalgamation between Indian and Vedic and Hindu philosophy and Iowa farmers. I mean, it is such a juxtaposition. It's amazing. But I've now been up there numerous times to give talks. And then Dick DeAngelis, he's a filmmaker. He does all these wonderful films on Iowa history. And so he reached out to me and said, will you tell the origin story of Parsons College? And I said, absolutely. And so I went up for filming and did that. And now the documentary is out. And so if you have a book in you, even if you write a sentence a day, just do it. Just write it. And then what you also want to do is you want to find a team around you. In other words, don't worry about the publisher yet. Write the book and then find a publisher. Find an editor who will be honest with you. And the best editors are the ones who are like, you're my friend, but this sucks. And so you need to change that sentence. You need to change that paragraph so that it becomes approachable to all people. And so I also have a saying that if you're a business owner, the best people you'll ever hire are people that have written books, in my opinion.
No, it makes sense though, because it's such a tedious process
Mhm.
and there's so much to it. So like this whole podcast is usually about how authors can take their books and put it into other opportunities. And what I really like is I'm not trying to promote like a rinse and repeat type of opportunity where people write a book and then they use the specific details from that book and create a course and then create that. It's more of just like a resemblance of you yourself,
Mhm.
what you believe in your values, and then you're able to provide more opportunities for yourself because of
Mhm.
that.
Mhm. Absolutely. I mean, again, a book doesn't have to be 65,000 words, which are usually, my books are usually about 65,000 words. I mean, if I'm looking at Parsons and the new book, they're pretty much exactly the same. But when you write something and you research it and you publish it, there's already, this sense about you that what you're doing is legitimate. I think it's interesting where when I start talking about hypnosis, people are like, come on, hypnosis, does that really work? And I said, well, what's interesting is that I was turned on to it by a senior FBI agent who works at headquarters, who's been using it for 25 years. And I don't do anything that doesn't work. Now, was I trepidatious about it? Yeah, of course I was. But then I went through the training and I realized that we're always hypnotizing ourselves, always. And then to have the St. Louis Business Journal write a piece about me, and that it legitimizes it, because I use this with executives, and everything that I do is confident. Not everything I do, but a lot of what I do is confidential. And when I work with people that are well known, there no one else is going to learn about that. But if you read that article, I tell a very quick story that I think relates to also what we're talking about when we're writing a book, or when we're writing the things that legitimize what we're doing. If you believe for a moment that we're always hypnotizing ourselves, here's the example that I use. If you spend 5 days a week watching nothing but CNN 8 hours a day, at the end of that week, you'll have a very particular view of the political landscape. In the same way that if in the next week you 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, watch Fox News, at the end of that, you'll have a very particular view of the political landscape. Well, what's true? What's real? Ultimately, it's what you choose to take in for yourself, that, oh, I believe that, or I don't believe that. Well, if you believe that you have a book in you, then you continue to tell yourself that, then you're going to end up having a book. Because here's the other piece about this. If you're in any kind of hypnosis work and your hypnotist or hypnotherapist, in my case, isn't giving you the homework to bring these things into action, it's never going to happen. So that's what I mean, that, sometimes in hypnosis, we talk about lowering a goal so that it's ridiculous, that there's no way you could fail at it. In other words, if Pooja came to me and you said, hey, I'm going to write a book, I'm like, great, what can you do each day? And you said, well, I can write a sentence a day. Awesome. If you write a sentence a day, it might take you 10 years to write your book, but guess what? You're in action to write your book. And so when we are working not only with our internal goals, our external goals, our team goals, etc., to your point from earlier, all of this relates. Everything that I'm doing all relates. And the last point that I'll make is this. My grandfather said that if you study one thing or many things deep enough, they all connect. And that has been a very powerful experience for me.
Yeah, this has been a great conversation. I learned so much about like fragrance and history. I just wanted to know, is there anything that you want to promote and where can we find you?
Sure. So you can find me at two websites. So if you're interested in the business work that I do, the first website would be Shihan-consultants.com. And Shihan is spelled Shihan. So Shihan-consultants.com. That's for the business stuff, specifically the forward program that I offer. And by the way, Shihan means teacher of teacher or leader of leaders. And then the other website is Shihan Wellness, no hyphen, but Shihan Wellness, Shihan wellness.com. ShihanWellness.com. Check that out. If you're in St. Louis, coming up on Saturday, October 24th from 2 to 4 p.m. at University Tower, which is on Brentwood Boulevard, I'll be presenting the spiritual teachings of incense and fragrance hypnosis. And so this is an opportunity for a group hypnosis session. I did it last a couple weeks ago to a sold out crowd. It was amazing. So if you're interested in that, you can also send an email to shihanwellness@gmail.com. I'll say it again, shihanwellness@gmail.com. That will either get to me or my assistant, Jessica. But we are very fast to respond. And so, and also LinkedIn, just go to LinkedIn, look up John Launius, and more than happy to connect there as well.
Thank you so much for being on my podcast.
Of course, Pooja, absolutely. You're fantastic. The work you do is great. So I'm very happy to have had an opportunity to chat today. I appreciate everything you've ever attended with the things that I do. I notice it, I acknowledge it, and I appreciate who you are.